In the long and winding history of the Pokemon games, there are countless tiny details, hidden systems, obscure mechanics, and small design decisions that quietly shape the way players experience these worlds. And exploring them feels a bit like easing into a slow river of memories where each fact drifts by at its own gentle pace, connecting generations of games without ever rushing. Starting with the curious truth that in the earliest versions of Pokemon Red and Blue, the game was so tight on memory that developers famously reused leftover code, including the glitchy remnants that help create Missing No, a creature that accidentally became a legend because the limited hardware forced the developers to improvise in ways modern players rarely notice. And moving to something equally strange, the internal map of the original Kanto region was coded as one continuous chunk, meaning that even caves and houses technically exist on the same larger map, simply hidden by loading zones that faded in and out, giving the illusion of separate environments. While over in Johto, the internal clock in gold and silver used a real world 24-hour system that even included unique encounters depending on the exact weekday, making it one of the earliest handheld games to use the concept of real time as a living mechanic. And speaking of gold and silver, players often overlook that the Japanese versions originally intended for the games to be played across the entirety of Japan. Not just the Johto region, but the Game Boy's storage limits forced the design team to scale the world down something that could fit on the cartridge, though they still managed to include both Kanto and Johto, creating the only mainline games with two full regions to explore in one adventure. A design choice that later generations never repeated due to how complex world design became in the years that followed. And drifting further along, we find an odd detail about the move Splash, which in the original Japanese version is actually called Hop, referencing koi fish jumping out of water rather than splashing, meaning the localized name created confusion for generations of players who wondered why a water-themed move did nothing even on land. And if you look closely at the animations in Diamond and Pearl, you'll find that the reason many moves seem slow is because the developers deliberately coded long hit lag frames to make attacks feel heavier, which caused competitive players to often prefer to turn off animations to keep battles moving quickly, especially during the era when battles could last for dozens of turns. While in the same Sinnoh games, Spiritom's original method of being encountered required players to talk to 32 real human players in the underground, a number chosen because the developers liked the idea of players needing a small community gathering to summon a mysterious Pokemon, and later generations removed this requirement to keep the Pokemon accessible long after the servers shut down, just like how in Black and White, the developers intentionally designed the Elite Four rooms with enormous spiraling animations so players would feel the jump from Pix, L art, to cinematic staging, marking one of the first mainline games to treat the Pokemon League as a dramatic set piece rather than a simple building with stairs. And drifting towards something more mechanical, there's a small quirk in the way critical hits were calculated in the earliest titles, where the move Slash had such an inflated critical hit ratio that it triggered crits nearly every time, due to older games basing crit chance directly on a Pokemon's speed stat, a system that also created bizarre interactions like Jolteon landing constant instant crits purely because it ran so fast, a system that was later standardized so all Pokemon had fairer odds. And in a similar quiet correction, the Poke Radar in Diamond and Pearl was originally designed around a chaining mechanic that took hundreds of attempts to master, and the developers admitted years later that the system was intentionally difficult because they wanted shiny hunting to feel like a rare commitment, though they softened the odds in later games when shinies became a more accessible part of the community experience. And speaking of shinies, the term shiny wasn't used in the games until Pokemon Gold and Silver, even though the concept existed in Red and Blue through certain palette swaps caused by programming quirks. But Gold and Silver made it official with a sparkling animation that became iconic, and Gyarados was chosen as the guaranteed shiny in the Lake of Rage encounter to teach the mechanic naturally rather than through tutorials, a moment many players still remember as their first truly special catch. While on the topic of unforgettable moments, the original Lavender Town theme used a unique audio technique called binaural detuning, where two slightly different tones play at once, creating a subtle, unsettling effect that the developers used intentionally to evoke the feeling of an eerie ghost town in a game otherwise filled with upbeat music. And in Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Sevi Islands were created not just as bonus content, but as a region designed solely to allow players to transfer Pokemon forward to Ruby and Sapphire, bridging generational gaps that otherwise would have left the older Pokemon stranded, something that mattered deeply to longtime fans who spent years raising teams they didn't want to lose. And in a more hidden pocket of development lore, Ruby and Sapphire were almost fully 3D games during early testing, but the Game Boy Advance hardware couldn't handle the rendering without sacrificing sprite quality, so the team returned to an enhanced 2D approach, while keeping the idea of a more nature-focused world to differentiate Hoenn from Johto and Kanto. And while exploring Hoenn, you may notice that the region has more water routes than any other mainline region, not by accident, but because the team wanted to evoke a sense of maritime adventure similar to parts of southern Japan. Though the reception was mixed enough that later games reduced water routes significantly, especially after players joked about needing too many repels just to get across Route 134, which also ties into an often forgotten mechanical choice that diving underwater was originally planned as a recurring feature in later generations, but was mostly removed because it required double-layered map design that significantly increased development time, though it returned in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, where the team finally had enough hardware freedom to make underwater areas visually distinct and expansive. While on the other side of regional development, Unova in Black and White was the first mainline region fully based on a location outside Japan, modeled after New York City and its surrounding areas, which inspired design choices like Castelia City's skyscraper layout and the Sky Arrow Bridge's impressive camera sweep animation that intentionally showcased how far the DS hardware could be pushed. And deep in Unova's code lies a hidden detail that the season system was originally going to impact evolution, but this idea was abandoned late in development because the team didn't want players to feel forced to wait real-world months just to evolve certain Pokemon, though seasons still affected Deerling and Sawsbuck's forms and certain encounter tables, creating the first Pokemon games where the environment itself visually changed over time. And if we drift back toward mechanics again, Pokemon X and Y were the first games to run on a full 3D framework for both the world and battle models, which required the team to recreate every Pokemon in the national dex using a new standardized animation rig, meaning these same models became the basis for many future games, including Sun and Moon, Let's Go, Sword and Shield, and even Scarlet and Violet, which explains why certain animations like basic idle stances stayed consistent across nearly a decade of releases. While in X and Y, another subtle detail appears in the form of trainer customization, a system the team initially thought would be too resource-heavy, but fan feedback was so overwhelmingly positive that customization became a core feature in nearly every generation afterward, shaping player identity in a way that was impossible during the early sprite-based eras. and in the quietly nostalgic world of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the decision to let your lead Pokemon follow behind you wasn't just a visual charm. The feature required a completely new set of overworld sprites for every existing Pokemon, one of the largest sprite investments in series history, which is partly why the feature wasn't immediately carried into later games, despite its immense popularity, though variations of following companions eventually returned in Let's Go, Sword and Shield's Isle of Armor, and Scarlet and Violet's Let's Go mechanic, where Pokemon explore independently. And another charming detail from those remakes is that the Pokewalker, a small pedometer accessory, actually stored miniaturized versions of Pokemon sprites and unique encounter tables that existed nowhere else in the franchise, making it one of the rarest and most unusual physical peripherals ever created for the series, connecting real-world motion to in-game training long before mobile games like Pokemon Go would expand the idea. And shifting back to world building, Alola in Sun and Moon introduced regional variants for the first time because the game directors wanted to show how ecosystems shape species differently, a concept inspired by real evolutionary divergence seen on isolated islands, and these variants became so iconic that later regions like Galar and Hisui continued the trend with their own unique forms, influencing competitive viability and world identity in equal measure. And speaking of competitive changes, Sun and Moon removed gyms not because they disliked the idea, but because they wanted a break from tradition after 7 generations of similar progression, replacing gyms with island trials designed to encourage puzzle solving and environmental interaction. Though many players still consider the Totem Pokemon battles some of the most atmospheric encounters in the series, and drifting gently into the world of Sword and Shield, the introduction of the wild area was intentionally placed early in the player's journey to make the world feel wide and open, acting as a test for an open world format that would later expand fully in Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet. And inside that wild area lies a detail many players miss. Certain Pokemon spawn only during precise weather combinations, creating one of the first systems where weather, time, and location simultaneously affected encounter tables. And as we glide back through the timeline, we end on a small but beloved piece of game history in Pokemon Yellow. Pikachu's happiness mechanic was the first step toward modern friendship values, and developers added the walking Pikachu not simply as a marketing tie-in to the anime, but as a way to test how players emotionally respond to Pokemon that visually react to their care, an experiment that shaped future mechanics like friendship, evolution, camp interactions, petting, grooming, and finally the bond-based features in more recent titles, creating a quiet thread of connection from one tiny walking sprite in 1998 to the complex emotional systems of the modern mainline games. Winding gently deeper into the world of Pokemon game history, it becomes clear that even the smallest corners of each title are full of details players often forget, beginning with the unusual truth that in Pokemon Emerald, the Battle Frontier facilities were not just meant to be difficult. They were each designed around mathematical patterns. The designers knew competitive players would eventually study, such as the Battle Pike using weighted probabilities to make certain rooms more likely after long winning streaks, a subtle way to keep players on edge while still rewarding careful decision-making, and drifting from there to the mysteries of Kanto once again. The Cerulean Cave layout in Fire Red and Leaf Green was intentionally redesigned to be more maze-like than the original Red and Blue version, because the developers wanted Mewtwo's lair to feel more like a true endgame dungeon rather than a simple cave, though they kept the original's vertical, ladder drop design as a nod to older players. And if you wander to Hoenn again, you might notice that in Ruby and Sapphire, the internal tide system along the seafloor cavern routes follows a hidden timer independent of the player's actions, meaning the water level rises and falls, whether you're there or not, replicating a real tidal pattern that surprised players when caves suddenly opened or closed without warning. And even in Johto, the developers played with subtle environmental systems long before they became mainstream, such as the Apricorn tree cycle in Gold and Silver, which used a unique daily reset that was independent of berry regrowth, making Apricorn gathering part of a scheduled ritual rather than a simple farming task. And drifting to another fascinating detail, the Pokemon Stadium games for Nintendo 64 included an internal rental leveling formula that secretly gave rental Pokemon better stats than their level indicated so beginners could compete without perfect teams. A balancing system so subtle that many competitive discussions from that era were shaped around the assumptions players made about unexpectedly strong rentals. While on the subject of borrowed teams, the original Colosseum and XD Shadow Pokemon had their purification requirements built around the idea of emotional reconnection, which is why walking, battling, and calling your Pokemon all played roles in purification, helping to emphasize the narrative theme that these Pokemon were recovering from trauma rather than simply undergoing a numerical transformation. And speaking of narrative themes, Unova in Pokemon Black and White was designed to feel like a complete reset, which is why only brand new Pokemon appear in the main story until you reach the post-game, a creative decision that forced players to form entirely new teams instead of relying on familiar favorites, marking the first and only generation structured this way. And within those games, the internal memory link system between Black and Black 2 or White and White 2 was meant to reward returning players with small background lore moments, demonstrating how the characters matured over time, a feature rarely discussed but deeply appreciated by fans. Ho followed the multi-game arc, and wandering elsewhere to Sinnoh for a moment, there's a hidden detail in the distortion world of Platinum, where Giratina's movements are scripted using a unique animation skeleton separate from every other Pokemon, because the developers wanted Giratina's presence to feel physically impossible within the normal geometry of the world, creating one of the most surreal environments ever placed in a mainline title, and staying in the realm of unusual worlds. The Hall of Origin from Diamond and Pearl originally required the Azure Flute to access an item never officially released, making Arceus essentially unobtainable in the intended in-game method. And when the event was finally recreated in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, it marked the first time players could experience the staircase, summoning animation exactly as it was designed for the DS era, creating a small but significant historical moment for longtime fans. And traveling to Kalos now, the French-inspired region's map layout was intentionally built around a radial hub and spoke design, where Lumiose City sits at the center, like a wheel, allowing players to return to the city repeatedly in a structure reminiscent of real Parisian districts. And this wheel-style architecture also influenced the pacing of the game's story, which is why so many major events bring the player back to Lumiose, while another subtle mechanic in the same games lies in horde battles, originally conceptualized as a way to assist EV training by allowing players to battle multiple low-level Pokemon at once. But it also doubled as a way to increase shiny odds through sheer encounter volume, a design choice that turned out to be unintentionally popular among shiny hunters. And drifting comfortably to Alola, the Sun and Moon games employ a unique day-night inversion between versions, with Moon shifting the clock 12 hours ahead, making the in-game world feel immediately different even for players starting their journey at the same real-world time. while the Executor Island scene was specifically added late in development to showcase how the Alolan regional variants symbolize the theme of environmental adaptation, using one Pokemon line to quietly communicate the region's ecological identity, and hidden deep in the game's data lies an even more curious detail. Ultra Beasts technically sit outside the usual height and weight coding constraints, allowing the designers to give them exaggerated measurements that would normally break the game's standard parameter limits, symbolizing their extra-dimensional origins in both lore and computational structure. And slipping over to Galar, the wild area in Sword and Shield wasn't just the franchise's first open environment. Internally, it was coded as a set of interconnected microzones, each with its own spawn tables and weather simulations that update simultaneously, which and the world could support dozens of on-screen Pokemon without collapsing performance, while another hidden Galar mechanic rests in the camping system, where each curry type has a friendship, experience, and healing value attached to it, essentially making curry a hybrid of a potion, a rare candy, and a soothe bell all at once, depending on how well the cooking minigame is executed, something many players overlook while rushing through recipes and shifting toward Hisui in Legends Arceus. The game implemented a behavior system where Pokemon react differently depending on the threat level category they belong to, such as skittish species fleeing, neutral species observing, and aggressive species attacking without hesitation, creating the first mainline title where the player themselves could be knocked out by wild Pokemon. A dramatic shift in the series' traditional combat structure, and this dynamic behavior helped shape the approach for Scarlet and Violet, where open-world exploration became the norm, though fans often forget that Scarlet and Violet's picnic system can generate eggs faster than any method in previous generations due to the passive accumulation of egg checks, effectively replacing the old daycare walking loop with a more passive, cozy mechanic that fits the game's relaxed open-world pacing. And looking further into Paldea's mechanics, wild Terra Pokemon are coded to remain in their Terra form until their shield breaks in battle, meaning they exist in a permanently crystallized state in the overworld, which is why their models glow intensely even before Combat begins, and drifting gently back to earlier times. In Pokemon Red and Blue, the internal type chart included several odd choices, such as ghost-type moves not affecting psychic types due to a programming oversight, even though the game's guidebook said the opposite, creating a contradiction that wasn't fixed until Generation 2, while in those same early games, the move Focus Energy was accidentally coded to lower the user's critical hit chance instead of raising it, a bug that went unnoticed by many players until data miners uncovered it years later. And another oddity of the Red and Blue code lies in the Safari Zone timer, which is actually a series of step counters that trigger automatic zone endings even if the player finds themselves mid-battle, creating sudden endings that felt like mysterious glitches to unsuspecting trainers. And drifting to another curious era, Pokemon Crystal was the first title to include animated sprites in battle, but the developers intentionally limited animation frames to keep the cartridge size manageable, meaning each Pokemon had only one or two looping motions, a small but charming innovation that paved the way for more fully animated models in later generations. And if you move ahead to Emerald, you'll find the game contains the highest number of unique battle facility rules in the entire franchise prior to the 3DS era, including obscure mechanics like banning Pokemon with identical held items in certain challenges or enforcing specific EV spreads for rental teams, making the Battle Frontier one of the most mechanically dense XP Riance's Game Freak ever produced. And gliding onward to the world of items, The amulet coin's doubling effect stacks with the prize money O power in X and Y, or with the luck incense in several games, allowing certain combinations to inflate prize earnings enormously, something speedrunners often use strategically in money-tight routes, while the leftovers healing effect is based on the original mechanics of the food item from the Pokemon trading card game, where recovery was measured in gradual increments, bridging an interesting piece of crossover design from the TCG to the video games. And in another quiet crossover detail, Pikachu's cry was updated in X and Y to match Ikue Otani's voice clips from the anime, making it one of the only Pokemon to receive a fully updated human-voiced cry rather than a retrofitted digital sound. And for players exploring Johto once more, the remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver contain a hidden feature where the Pokegear's radio channels play different versions of older songs depending on the time of day or the day of the week, including special tracks that only play during the weekly Sinnoh Music Hour, giving a subtle air of nostalgia that rewards players who check the radio often. And drifting over to Kalos again, the Tower of Mastery was deliberately shaped to resemble the Mega Bracelet symbol, reflecting the central theme of the region's connection between humans and their Pokemon through Mega Evolution, while Mega Evolution itself internally uses a temporary stat override system that recalculates values dynamically each turn, meaning the T transformation doesn't replace a Pokemon's stats, but instead layers a special modifier over them for the duration of battle, a complexity hidden beneath the simplicity of a glowing animation. And if you wander back to Unova, rotation battles and triple battles were created as an experiment to see whether players preferred strategic positioning or rapid multi-target action. But because neither format became as popular as double battles, they were phased out quietly in future games, appearing only rarely in later titles, and drifting finally toward a cozy mechanical detail in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. The catching mechanic that replaces battling for wild encounters was built entirely around a modified version of the motion control system from Pokemon Go, meaning the game internally calculates a throw arc and circle timing mechanic similar to mobile gameplay, making it the first mainline console title to blend handheld Pokemon math with mobile Pokemon catching logic, a small connective thread that represented the franchise's evolving design philosophies across decades of experimentation. Sinking deeper into the gentle current of Pokemon game history, more small and fascinating pieces of the franchise begin to surface, starting with the surprising detail that in Pokemon Platinum, the developers subtly adjusted encounter tables all across Sinnoh to fix pacing issues from Diamond and Pearl, meaning certain caves, grass patches, and water routes were intentionally redesigned to reduce frustration, especially in places like Mount Coronet, where players previously encountered Zub at disproportionately high rates. And drifting from there into something equally overlooked, the Move Relearner in the same Generation 4 titles was designed around a hidden move memory table that stored every learnable level-up move by index, allowing players to recover any move in a way far more flexible than the earlier move tutors from Fire Red and Leaf Green. And this system later became the basis for the universal Remember Any Move at Any Time feature introduced in Legends Arceus and carried into Scarlet and Violet, bridging an important but subtle mechanical shift that made team building smoother across modern games. And sliding back to Kanto, players often forget that in Pokemon Yellow, the reason Pikachu reacts with various emotions on the status screen is because the game stored a happiness value that updated not only with walking and battles, but also with whether Pikachu fainted, was placed in the PC, or saw the player give it vitamins, making it the first Pokemon title with a full emotional state tied to visible feedback, and drifting gently into Hoenn. In Ruby and Sapphire, the Trick House on Route 110 was originally planned to update with more puzzles after the champion battle, but the idea was scrapped because of development time. However, leftover text in the code still references unused Trick House layouts that never made it into the final game, offering a peek into the creative ambition of early GBA design, while another quirk of the Hoenn games lies in Mirage Island's spawn logic, which uses a random daily value matched against the player's party Pokemon IDs, making the island so rare that many players never saw it naturally despite checking for years, creating a small cultural legend around its hidden location. And if we drift across the ocean to Ore in Pokemon Colosseum, the game's snag mechanic uses an inverse catch rate system where shadow Pokemon become significantly easier to catch as their health drops, but only while they remain in their corrupted state. Once purified, their catch rates return to normal species values, a detail that subtly changes how players approach team building during the early segments of the story, and moving deeper into Aura's sequel, XD Gale of Darkness. The developers implemented the Call command to remedy the absence of the sleep-wake mechanic from the mainline series, allowing players to wake their own Pokemon instantly while also lowering the shadow gauge, creating a system that merged battle strategy and purification progression seamlessly into one button and wandering towards Sinnoh again. The Great Marsh in Diamond and Pearl has a hidden mechanic where daily rotating encounter slots can generate species with drastically higher shiny odds due to unexpected interactions between its table restructuring and the Poke Radar algorithm, though this quirk was ironed out in Platinum when the encounter system was tightened and optimized. And speaking of shinies, players often overlook that in Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, the shiny charm was introduced for the first time, and it operates using a layered RNG boost that adds extra rerolls behind the scenes rather than simply modify N-G, the base odds, making it one of the most mathematically efficient shiny boosting items in the series. And drifting into a different corner of Unova, Join Avenue's popularity system was based on real-world social simulation games the developers admired at the time, allowing customer flow to scale depending on how many players the user interacted with via local communication, a feature that created uniquely bustling avenues during the heyday of DS wireless connectivity, especially in Japan, and shifting our pace to the Kalos region. The super training minigames in X and Y were originally intended to be a standalone training mode, not tied directly to EVs, but it was eventually merged with a competitive training system so that even casual players could optimize their teams without needing to battle endless hordes or consume vitamins, marking one of the first significant accessibility shifts toward modern stat customization. And traveling over to Johto once more in Gold and Silver, the roaming beasts Raikou, Entei, and Suicune use a movement algorithm tied to the player's last location and direction of travel, causing them to slide between routes in predictable patterns if the player understands their movement logic, something speedrunners and shiny hunters exploited to track them far more efficiently than the average casual player. While the internal system that causes the beasts to run immediately each turn is not actually a script, but a forced flee flag tied to their encounter template, something the remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver preserved deliberately to maintain the chaotic feel of the original encounters. And drifting toward an atmospheric detail, the Whirl Islands in Gold and Silver were constructed using one of the most complex internal cave layouts of the GBC era, with multiple layers of vertical cycling that had to be tricked using tile-based transitions rather than true height differences, meaning the cave is technically flat even though it visually appears multi-leveled, a result of creative trickery necessary on limited hardware and sliding across the timeline slightly forward. In Diamond and Pearl, the Poffin cooking minigame used a rotational timing system based on how accurately players trace the stylus motions along the bowl's path, and the developers intentionally tuned the stirring speed so that high-level Poffins could only be consistently produced with extremely smooth stylus control, giving the minigame unexpected mechanical depth that many players only discovered years later. And drifting toward the topic of Pokemon cries, in Generation 3, the developers replaced many of the harsh, grainy cries from the original Game Boy titles with more melodic GBA-balanced versions. But because they didn't want to break player familiarity, several iconic cries like those of Gyarados, Mewtwo, and Zapdos were left mostly unchanged, even if they stood out against the updated soundscape and wandering toward another unique system. The Pokewalker from Heart Gold and Soul Silver used a probabilistic encounter table where each step you took generated an internal step seed that cycled through a small range of hidden values, meaning at certain rare Pokemon could appear only when the device hit specific seeds, creating an experience where walking patterns genuinely influenced which Pokemon players discovered, far more directly than most realized. And drifting next to Alola, Sun and Moon's SOS system for summoning allies during battle drew inspiration from wildlife pack behavior, and its coding reflects this. Certain species have a drastically higher call rate when below half health, in rain, or when intimidated by larger predators, creating dynamic, environmental combat encounters that mimicked natural ecosystems in a surprisingly advanced way for a handheld Pokemon title. And staying in Alola, one quietly charming detail lies in the Pokepelago's bean farming system, which uses a real-time growth cycle that continues even when the 3DS is in sleep mode, effectively making Pokepelago one of the first fully passive Pokemon raising systems to progress without needing manual player input and slipping ahead to Galar again. Sword and Shield's max raid battles use an internal shield mechanic that reduces the effect of super effective damage until the barrier is broken, not as a difficulty gimmick, but because the developers wanted multiplayer raids to last long enough for every participant to take meaningful turns, preventing one ultra-powerful player from ending the encounter instantly. And in a separate mechanical quirk, Gigantamax forms are stored as alternate model states rather than separate Pokemon forms, which is why Pokemon like Gengar, Butterfree, and Hatterene technically still register as their base species even while transformed, a small but important optimization for how the games handle large-scale animations. And drifting toward Paldea now, Scarlet and Violet's open-world spawn system generates Pokemon groups using spawn families, where lead species often appear with babies or lower-stage evolutions, mirroring realistic wildlife pack structure and smoothing out visual clutter in the environment. While the Let's Go auto battle feature calculates damage using a simplified version of in-battle math that removes critical hits and weather multipliers to prevent sudden, unexpected knockouts, making auto battling safer for exploration but less efficient than manual combat in high-level areas, and drifting back to the early handheld era. One forgotten detail is that in Pokemon Crystal, the Battle Tower was one of the first experimental endgame facilities designed to test players with rules that more closely resembled competitive battling, and its success directly influenced the creation of the more advanced battle frontiers that arrived in Emerald and later in Platinum. While drifting to a different quirky memory, The original mystery gift system in gold and silver used the Game Boy Color's infrared port, letting two players exchange items simply by pointing their systems at each other. But the system also included an unused TV event function that was never activated outside Japan, where certain real-world broadcasts could trigger in-game events, making it one of the earliest prototypes for multimedia Pokemon interactions. And as we wander toward the topic of field abilities, it's interesting that Stench, Cute Charm, and Illuminate in various generations influence encounter rates, not by modifying percentages directly, but by re-rolling the encounter slot selection, effectively reshaping what the player runs into without altering the overall frequency of encounters. While another subtle ability interaction can be seen with Synchronize, which in several games applies its nature E-matching effect before the shiny check, meaning Synchronize cannot influence shiny odds, but can make shiny hunting more predictable when players seek specific natures, and easing back toward regional design. The desert areas in Ruby and Sapphire were among the first zones built around weather as an environmental hazard, with sandstorm damaging every turn unless specific Pokemon types or abilities prevented it. And this inspired Sinnoh's hail routes and Unova's heavy snow areas, creating a tradition of weather-themed travel challenges that continued across multiple generations. And in a quieter corner of the design philosophy, many players don't realize that in Pokemon X and Y, the Lysandra battle in Team Flare's base is coded to trigger a slight camera shake effect every time the player's HP drops into the red, heightening the tension subconsciously through audiovisual cues, while another hidden detail lies in Kalos's berry fields, which use a cross-pollination algorithm that determines hybrid berry outcomes based on risk-reward pairs, making berry breeding one of the most intricate side systems in the 3DS era. Though it was overshadowed by more visible features like Mega Evolution and the Friend Safari, and drifting calmly toward the Switch era again, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl restored many unused difficulty tweaks planned for Platinum but cut from the original DS remakes, including improved trainer AI flags and rebalanced boss movesets, a detail found by data miners who noticed that the battle logic in the remakes quietly reflects Platinum more than Diamond and Pearl, creating a unique hybrid that feels familiar yet subtly enhanced for modern players, gently rounding out another layer of Pokemon's long mechanical tapestry. As we continue drifting through the long, peaceful river of Pokemon game history, more quiet and fascinating details begin to surface like little glimmers beneath the water, beginning with the subtle truth that in Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the game's internal engine still uses many foundational routines from Ruby and Sapphire, but overlays them with a Kanto-themed map system that had to be converted manually from the Game Boy architecture, meaning that areas like Viridian Forest and Rock Tunnel are actually hybrid spaces, built partly with modern tile logic and partly with code structures inherited from the original Red and Blue, a small engineering puzzle that made the remakes feel faithful while still functioning on new hardware, and drifting gently from there into a strange feature many players overlook. The fame checker in those same remakes was created because the developers felt that NPCs in the early games lacked personality, so they built a database of dialogue clues about gym leaders and important characters, making it the first supplemental lore device designed specifically to deepen world building without altering the main story. And though the fame checker never returned in future generations, it quietly influenced the concept of the trainer card star system and later the Rotom Phone's detailed Pokédex entries, each inheriting the idea of piecing together small facts about characters across a region. And if we slip forward into Sinnoh again, in Diamond and Pearl the developers were proud of the Poketch, a multifunction touchscreen gadget that was actually built on a modular app table, letting the team expand it late in development without rewriting code, which is why dozens of small tools like the friendship checker, counter, and daycare app exist as simple modules that can be toggled on and off. While in Platinum, the team refined the Poketch to scroll smoothly using a sidebar, something originally unimaginable in the early DS hardware tests. And as we drift deeper into Hoenn, many players don't realize that in Ruby and Sapphire, the internal tide mechanics weren't the only environmental system running in real time. Certain berry patches also use growth cycles tied directly to the internal clock. And if the player changes the time on the Game Boy Advance, the game triggers a clock reset flag that locks berry growth for a long period as an anti-tampering measure, a design choice that confused players but was considered necessary at the time to preserve the idea of real-time growth. And this anti-tampering philosophy later influenced features like the Kalos berry fields, which use soil moisture values and irrigation timers that continue running even when the game is closed, making berry breeding in X and Y far more dynamic than earlier systems. And drifting gently to Johto once more, the remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver contain a charming but rarely noticed feature where certain radio programs play slightly off-key versions of classic soundtrack themes, mimicking radio distortion to create the illusion of imperfect broadcast quality, and the developers specifically coded these distortions to evoke the feeling of nostalgic, small-town radio stations, echoing Johto's cozy atmosphere, while another small detail hides in the ruins of Alph, where the puzzle panels use a special flipping algorithm that ensures the final piece will always land in a solvable configuration no matter how the player rotates it, subtly guiding the experience without breaking the illusion of a physical sliding tile puzzle. And shifting now toward Unova, in Black and White, the Entralink system used a complex local wireless setup that could sync multiple worlds together without needing the internet, creating a semi-multiplayer experience long before Pokemon's online systems were fully mature, and the developers built the Entralink around a radial teleport system that placed players at equidistant points, ensuring smooth performance on the DS, even when multiple players were interacting with each other via shared missions. And just beyond Unova's borders lies a curious detail. In Black 2 and White 2, the Pokestar Studios filming mechanic runs on a miniature scripting language that controls camera angles, dialogue, and battle sequences dynamically, essentially turning Pokemon battles into small, interactive cutscenes, making it one of the most unusual and mechanically complex side features ever implemented in a mainline Pokemon game. And drifting toward Kalos, players often forget that X and Y introduced Sky Battles as a specialized aerial combat system, but the coding difficulties of filtering eligible Pokemon led to unusual restrictions, such as levitating Pokemon like Rotom not being allowed despite floating clearly above the ground. A quirk the developers later admitted was due to animation limitations, not lore logic, and similarly in Kalos, the Friend Safari's powerful IV bonuses come from a hidden trust level variable that increases the more the player interacts with friends on their 3DS system, making Friend Safari encounters unusually strong by design to encourage social connectivity, something the developers felt aligned with the cooperative spirit of Generation 6. And speaking of the 3DS era, the move to fully animated 3D battles in X and Y created unexpected issues regarding performance, which is why certain double battles in Lumio City suffer framerate drops due to the older hardware struggling to render complex geometry and shadows alongside two full battle rigs. And this is also why many Pokemon use simpler idle animations in the background during certain cutscenes, a trick the developers use to preserve consistency across large regions. And drifting down to the warm islands of Alola, in Sun and Moon, the developers created the Poke Finder as a spiritual successor to Pokemon Snap, using a hidden interest value that determines how often wild Pokemon appear in photo spots, and certain species are coded to react to the player's zoom level, meaning subtle camera movements can trigger different poses, a level of detail rarely acknowledged by players focused on the main story. And within the same region, totem Pokemon use an inflated stat template rather than a simple level increase, giving them boosted defense, special defense, and occasionally higher speed values beyond any naturally leveled Pokemon of that species could achieve, making totem encounters feel like boss battles rather than normal fights. And drifting forward to Galar, Sword and Shield's move to remove certain Pokemon from the regional decks was driven partly by the need to remake every model for higher resolution and new shader requirements, something that would have overwhelmed the development timeline if every Pokemon from every generation had been included. Yet the updated models allowed for dynamic lighting, smoother fur rendering, and more expressive facial animations than earlier titles. And the wild area that debuted in these games uses a cell streaming system that loads terrain, weather, and Pokemon density in small chunks as the player moves, similar to open world techniques used in larger console titles, allowing Galar to feel more alive without overwhelming the Switch hardware. And drifting even further to Hisui, Legends Arceus implemented a fascinating AI system where wild Pokemon have three basic behavioral states: unaware, alert, and hostile, and these states change dynamically based on line of sight, sound detection, and throwable items like mud balls or berries, making it the first Pokemon game where stealth, distraction, and ambush strategies were as important as traditional battling, while in a separate layer of complexity. The game's crafting system uses an internal weight and rarity index that determines how often items like iron chunks or medicinal leeks appear in each biome, creating resource distribution that encourages exploration rather than grinding in one location. And drifting gently to Paldea, Scarlet and Violet's open-world spawning algorithm uses a wave-based system where Pokemon appear in pulses every few seconds, filling nearby spawn points algorithmically rather than pre-placing encounters. And this method allows for groups of Pokemon to wander semi-naturally, forming herds, families, or wandering clusters that visually communicate ecosystem structure more clearly than earlier static routes. And picnic mechanics add another layer, since certain meal powers temporarily adjust both encounter rates and shiny odds using additive multipliers that stack with charm bonuses, producing the powerful sandwich-boosted shiny hunting methods that became popular among players. While another small quirk lies in the Terra Raid battles, where the boss's HP bar is rendered using a separate combat layer that updates independently from the player's animations, which is why attacks sometimes appear delayed or desynchronized, a side effect of the game's attempt to preserve raid pacing across multiple asynchronous client states and drifting quietly back into older regions. In Pokemon Emerald, the reason the Battle Frontier Brain titles are formatted differently from ordinary trainer classes is because they use special boss trainer flags that allow the game to load unique fanfare, music, and dynamic background elements. And these flags were later repurposed for the champion battles in the DS games and eventually for Dynamax and Terra bosses in the Switch era, showing how a single design idea echoed across decades. And in Kanto, the Origi, Now Red and Blue contain a peculiar oversight where the internal base stats of several Pokemon were changed late in development, but their Pokédex entries were not updated, which is why descriptions referencing physical sizes or strength sometimes conflict with in-game stats, though these inconsistencies eventually became part of the franchise's charm and drifting slowly towards Sinnoh again. The underground mining minigame from Diamond and Pearl uses a probability table that calculates which fossils or items appear based on the number of hits left before collapse, meaning that digging carefully, rather than frantically, can actually increase the odds of excavating specific treasures, a subtle technique discovered by fans years later. And finishing this gentle drift through the long tapestry of Pokemon mechanics, it's worth noting that across all generations, the developers consistently reused internal systems in careful ways, such as the happiness value from Yellow becoming the foundation for friendship evolutions, the double battlefields from Ruby and Sapphire evolving into rotation battles in Unova, and the real-time clock from Gold and Silver inspiring seasonal shifts in Unova and entire ecosystems in Alola and Paldea, demonstrating that the Pokemon games across handhelds, remakes, open worlds, and experimental spin-offs are tied together by hundreds of small creative decisions that ripple across generations, each adding quiet depth to a series that continues to grow while carrying the gentle echoes of everything that came before. Drifting once more into the gentle stream of Pokemon game history, we uncover another long stretch of hidden mechanics, quiet design choices, and small curiosities that shape the series in ways players rarely notice, starting with the unusual truth that in Pokemon Red and Blue, the in-game trainers do not actually check whether the player is standing in front of them before initiating a battle. Instead, they check a straight horizontal or vertical vision line extending infinitely until blocked by a wall, which is why certain trainers can spot the player from unusually far distances if the route design creates a long, open lane. And while this feels intentional, it was simply a result of the early Game Boy engine simplifying line of sight into a directional ray rather than a range-based detection, a quirk that later generations replaced with more natural distance checks, and sliding gently from that into another odd piece of Game Boy programming. The internal RNG in Red and Blue was not properly reset when loading a save file, meaning certain events such as encounters, critical hits, and item effects could be subtly predicted by observing seed patterns, something speedrunners later used to manipulate outcomes in ways the developers never imagined. While another quirk from that era lies in the cycling road physics in Red and Blue, which do not actually simulate slope movement, but instead force the player into automatic southward movement by repeatedly overriding directional input, essentially faking gravity through brute force input locking, a clever solution for extremely limited hardware. And drifting forward toward Gold and Silver, those games introduced breeding for the first time using a simple genetic table that determined inherited moves and species. But the move inheritance system originally only allowed males to pass down TM moves, something that wasn't corrected until later generations when the developers standardized inheritance rules to match modern expectations. And in those same Johto games, the internal happiness value used for certain evolutions fluctuates depending on the exact time of day, with nighttime happiness increasing slightly slower to account for the darker, moodier aesthetic of the region, while friendship-decreasing events such as fainting have larger penalties at night, quietly reinforcing a subtle atmosphere-driven design philosophy and shifting toward Hoenn. In Ruby and Sapphire, the developers introduced battle weather as a true strategic mechanic for the first time, and because they wanted weather to feel powerful, they made abilities like Drizzle and Drought generate permanent weather lasting until the battle ended, a mechanic that later proved too strong competitively, leading to Gen 6 adding a 5-turn limit to weather abilities, fundamentally reshaping competitive play and altering the legacy of Pokemon like Politoed, Ninetales, and Tyranitar, and drifting towards something quieter. The secret base framework in those same Hoenn games uses the same internal structure as trainer houses, which is why some base decorations act as functional furniture, with sit and rest flags attached, effectively turning secret bases into small, interactable spaces despite the modest GBA hardware. And touching briefly on the remakes Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, those games introduced soaring on Latios and Latias using a semi-open sky map that is actually a compressed version of Hoenn's overworld, with each location stored as a microzone that loads only as the player swoops into it, creating an illusion of seamless flight, even though the game is switching maps rapidly behind the scenes. And drifting towards Sinnoh next, Diamond and Pearl's contest system features a hidden scoring algorithm where the visual round score is not only influenced by dress-up items, but also by whether the item's categories match the entered contest type, and using the correct color family or accessory theme yields larger bonuses, even though the game never explicitly explains this, giving contests unexpected strategic complexity, while the rhythm-based dance rounds, later added in Platinum, expanded this depth with timing multipliers that scaled depending on the player's previous round performance and drifting deeper into Sinnoh's complexities. The move to Fog in Diamond and Pearl originally removed certain field hazards, such as spikes even in competitive battles, but because this mechanic wasn't well communicated, many players did not realize its utility, leading to defog becoming one of the most essential moves in the entire competitive scene, once later generations embraced and clarified hazard removal, marking it as one of the rare moves that grew in importance over time rather than deck, lining, and sliding to a different corner of regional design. The old chateau in Diamond and Pearl contains unique ghost encounters that use special encounter flags separate from the normal system, which is why the Ghost Girl and Butler silently appear without using wild battle logic, essentially functioning as scripted illusions rather than creatures, a rare example of Pokemon using environmental storytelling instead of battles to evoke emotion, and wandering into Unova again. In Pokemon Black and White, the reason the region feels more narrative-driven is because the development team wrote the story before completing the region layout, reversing the usual process, and this allowed for stronger thematic bonds between locations and plot events, such as the way Nimbasa City's amusement park symbolizes N's childlike worldview, or the way Opelucid City changes aesthetics depending on version to reflect ideological differences between the games. And speaking of versions, Black and White include the largest number of version-exclusive city layouts in franchise history, with Black City and White Forest functioning as two entirely unique locations that evolve differently depending on how often the player interacts with others via local wireless, meaning two players with identical playtime can still end up with drastically different city populations, making it one of the most unusual and dynamic world features Game Freak ever created. And shifting toward Generation 6. In X and Y, the bonding system with Pokemon through Pokemon-Ami actually affects in-battle outcomes via a hidden event, Fection stat that increases critical hit chance, evasion, and even survival at 1 HP through a helping hand effect. Though these bonuses are separate from the friendship system used for evolutions, meaning a Pokemon can have nearly no friendship and still protect its trainer through affection if properly cared for in Amy. A mechanic later streamlined into the affection system in Sword and Shield, and drifting toward Kalos again. The Lumiose City blackout at launch was caused not by a coding oversight, but by the save file being locked into inaccessible map sectors based on how the camera rotated, effectively trapping the player in a corrupted coordinate system, which is why the immediate patch targeted only specific streets, preventing the camera from entering zones where the bug could trigger again, making it one of the rare times a Pokemon game required an urgent post-launch fix. And sliding further toward Kalos's underappreciated features, the Battle Chateau uses a noble rank system influenced by the player's daily performance, where defeating high-ranking nobles and earning invitations gradually increases the difficulty ceiling, creating a scaling progression that mirrors high society hierarchy structure, while also functioning as one of the most efficient experience farming locations in the 3DS era. And drifting south to Alola, Sun and Moon's Pokédex is one of the only Pokédexes that reacts directly to the player's progress through sound design, with different cries playing depending on how many Pokemon the player has recorded, and the Rotom Dex uses a mood index that determines how frequently it speaks, offers suggestions, or displays special eyes on the screen, creating a subtle personality layer that evolves as the journey continues. And the same region's Z move animations were handcrafted individually for each species type category, which is why some Z moves look exaggerated or comedic, while others appear intense and dramatic, reflecting the developer's intentional stylistic variety and sliding closer to modern times. Sword and Shield's dynamic weather cycle updates at midnight based on the Switch system clock, creating a predictable rotation that shiny hunters and competitive players use to target specific weather-dependent spawns, while the overworld Pokemon wander using invisible pathing bubbles that prevent them from walking into terrain they can't navigate, explaining why some species appear to pace in loops even though they seem free-roaming, and drifting once more into Hisui. Legends Arceus's battle system does not follow a strict turn order, but instead uses an action speed formula influenced by agility stats, move weight, and action types, meaning that performing a heavy attack can push the user's next action far back in the order, allowing wild Pokemon to attack consecutively if the timing aligns, making Legends Arceus the first mainline adjacent Pokemon title, where turn economy operates more like a strategy RPG than a traditional turn-based battle. And drifting toward crafting systems, the portable crafting bench in Legends Arceus calculates item yields based on small internal RNG rolls that can occasionally grant bonus outputs for items like Pokeballs or potions when using rarer materials, a hidden benefit never displayed to the player but confirmed through the game's internal tables. And wandering to Paldea now, Scarlet and Violet's item pickup system places invisible loot nodes across the map that refresh independently of time of day, relying instead on a hidden collection cycle that rotates every few minutes, which is why areas like the beaches or cliffsides often generate clusters of items at once, while towns generate fewer pickups to control frame performance. And the Let's Go auto battle system avoids entering battle screens by calculating simplified clash values using level, type, and base power, which is why Pokemon with powerful priority moves or high speed don't necessarily perform better in auto mode. The system ignores those variables entirely, focusing solely on raw stats and type matchups. And drifting gently back to an overlooked detail, in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the developers reintroduced the Poketch as a permanent screen overlay option because fans requested it for nostalgia, but they also hid new quality of life functions within it, such as marking Pokemon on the map during certain legendary hunts, a feature not present in the originals, making it a small but modernized twist, and drifting at last toward a sleepy final thought. Across all generations, the Pokemon titles maintain a surprising legacy of reusing concepts in gently evolving ways, from happiness beginning in Yellow to affection in X and Y to bond-based interactions in modern games, from simple weather in Hoenn to elaborate ecosystems in Paldea, and from battle experiments like the early Battle Tower to massive cooperative raids in Galar, reminding us that the games grow gradually, layer by layer, building on quiet foundations that often remain invisible to players, but shape their entire journey in the Pokemon world. Easing once more into the slow drifting current of Pokemon game history, we sink into another long stretch of quiet details and hidden mechanics that shape the series from behind the scenes, starting with the lesser-known fact that in Pokemon Emerald, the Safari game's mechanics are not actually identical to those in Ruby and Sapphire. Instead, Emerald adjusts catch modifiers for certain species, so their catch difficulty matches Game Freak's internal difficulty index, meaning some Pokemon, like Phanpy and Girafarig, are unexpectedly easier to catch in Emerald compared to their Ruby and Sapphire counterparts. A tiny rebalance almost nobody notices because it hides entirely in encounter math. And drifting toward Fire Red and Leaf Green, the reason the remakes do not include the Dark or Steel-type moves from Johto until the Sevii lands is because the developers wanted the early Kanto portion to remain faithful to the original difficulty curve, effectively delaying the introduction of certain modern-type attacks so Kanto would retain its older gameplay identity. While the Sevii Islands functioned as a gentle midpoint between old and new mechanics, serving as a bridge to the Hoenn generation's movesets and abilities, and sliding further into the early handheld era. One overlooked detail is that the Pokédex entries in Ruby and Sapphire were written with a more biological tone compared to previous games, with the writing team instructed to focus on ecosystem behavior, migration, and environmental niches, making the Hoenn Pokédex one of the most ecologically coherent in the franchise. And drifting from there into the Sinnoh region, in Diamond and Pearl, the internal step counter used to determine egg cycling, Pokéradar recharge, and Honeytree RNG is shared across all those systems, meaning that performing unrelated movements like pacing in grass patches can indirectly influence Honeytree results hours later due to hidden step thresholds. A strange intertwining of mechanics that only became widely understood once data miners extracted the internal scripts. And speaking of honey trees, the rare appearance of Munchlax on only 4 specific trees is determined by a unique seed generation tied to the player's trainer ID and secret ID combinations, making the distribution of Munchlax trees effectively unique for every player file. One of the rare cases where personal trainer identity alters the world structure in a meaningful way, and drifting gently ahead, in Platinum, the developers introduced special NPC routines called directional drift patterns to give towns more lively movement, such as Snowpoint villagers walking in looping paths and Jubilife NPCs stopping for idle behaviors like stretching, adding subtle motion to the world that made Sinnoh feel less static compared to the original Diamond and Pearl. And wandering toward Unova, many players forget that in Black and White, the reason wild Pokemon appear in a shaking grass tile only once at a time is because the engine strictly enforces a single special encounter state, ensuring that shaking grass, dust clouds, swirling water, and airborne shadows never overlap, allowing the DS hardware to streaml. Ein spawn checks, without conflicts. And this was also the reason rare Audino farming became so reliable. The shaking grass system always guarantees a single special spawn tile, making it predictable for leveling strategies. And drifting toward another Unova quirk. In Black 2 and White 2, the hidden grottos operate on a replenishment timer that only advances when the player takes 256 steps, not when the real-time clock updates, meaning that even if a player waits hours in real life, the grotto will not respawn unless they physically move around the map, creating an interesting blend of time-based and movement-based resource generation. And sliding into Kalos, one of the most interesting hidden mechanics lies in how X and Y calculate Pokemon size variation for the first time, assigning each species a random internal height and weight within a small range, which explains why certain Pokemon appear slightly smaller or larger in cutscenes or when shown in comparison to the player. A subtle randomization that added individuality without being explicitly highlighted. And drifting next into the Friend Safari. The reason Friend Safari Pokemon can have two perfect IVs is because Game Freak wanted to create a system that rewarded social connectivity without overwhelming competitive balance, which caused major bugs in early prototypes where the player character would fall through the bridge, requiring the development team to create redundant collision layers to stabilize the crossing. And drifting into Black and White's lore structure, the idea of presenting the player as a morally evaluated figure was intentionally explored through NPC dialogue that subtly questions Pokemon battling, making Unova the only region where the ethics of capturing and battling Pokemon are directly challenged within the main story through N and Getsis, adding a philosophical dimension rarely seen elsewhere in the franchise. And moving toward Black 2 and White 2, the sequels include more post-game content than any other DS Pokemon title, including the complete Pokédex habitat list, expanded legendary hunts, and a multi-regional tournament system, making them some of the most content-rich mainline Pokemon games ever produced. And drifting into Kalos, X and Y's Parfum Palace famously caused performance issues due to the number of moving objects and animated reflections in the courtyard scene, pushing the 3DS hardware so hard that frame rate drops sometimes occurred even in single battles afterward, prompting the developers to limit 3D rendering in several later scenes of the game. And speaking of 3D, X and Y were the first Pokemon games where every trainer has a full-body 3D model with dynamic facial animations, which were reused extensively in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire to accelerate development. And drifting deeper into Mega Evolution, Mega Charizard X and Mega Charizard Y were designed to embody two different fan fantasies: a physically intimidating dragon and an enhanced fire-based aerial fighter, which is why their stat spreads focus on completely different archetypes, while Mega Gengar's design intentionally references its old shadow sprite from Red and Blue, giving it an exaggerated grin to match its original battle pose. And sliding into Alola now, the Z-move animations were so elaborate that the developers built them to run independently of the overworld, essentially functioning as temporary cutscenes that override the battle renderer, which is why they maintain consistent frame rate even in double battles. And drifting toward regional variants, Alolan forms are coded as separate species with shared evolution lines, which is why an Alolan Marowak born in Alola cannot revert to a Cantonian form even when traded into other games. And sliding gently into Galar, Sword and Shield's wild area uses a sophisticated streaming method where each weather type loads specific spawn tables, particle effects, and lighting conditions. But to maintain Switch performance, the wild area loads NPCs only when the player is within a certain radius, which is why trainers sometimes appear to fade in suddenly from the fog. And drifting deeper into Galar, gym battles use scripted lighting that changes color based on the gym type, and this lighting is stored as a battle environment overlay separate from the arena itself, making Galar's gym battles some of the most visually customizable battles in the series. And gliding into the Isle of Armor, Kubfu's training towers say forced solo battle, flags that temporarily disable switching and cooperative effects, preserving the integrity of the trial format, while the Crown Tundra's legendary encounters use a soft lock prevention system that guarantees players cannot accidentally feint certain scripted legendary Pokémon without receiving another chance to catch them, ensuring that newcomers do not soft lock their Pokédex completion. And drifting toward Hisui, Legends Arceus introduced a unique system where Pokémon can directly attack the player, and to accommodate this, the developers implemented invisible safety zones around cliffs and deep water to prevent players from unintentionally being knocked into lethal terrain, a subtle safeguard that keeps exploration fluid rather than frustrating. And the crafting system in Hisui draws from unused ideas originally designed for Heart Gold and Soul Silver's Safari Zone customization, repurposed into a fully realized item system that encourages resource gathering. And drifting ahead into Paldea, Scarlet and Violet's raid battles use asynchronous turn calculations to support online multiplayer, meaning each player's game simulates certain actions independently and reconciles the results afterward, which explains occasional desyncs in move order or HP bars, a technical compromise necessary to keep raids functional without long connection delays. And sliding into another Paldea detail, the overworld models for some large Pokémon like Dondozo and Cheetatan use simplified mesh structures while exploring, but switch to high detail rigs during battle transitions, reserving performance while still presenting detailed designs when needed. And drifting into move mechanics again, Scarlet and Violet's Terra Blast changes type dynamically based on the user's Terra type, using a dual flag priority system that checks both Terra state and stat alignment to determine whether the move is physical or special, making it one of the most complex single moves Game Freak has ever introduced. And finally, drifting back across all generations, one of the most quietly impressive aspects of Pokémon development is how the games often feature elaborate systems hidden beneath simple surfaces, like breeding tables based on hidden stats, weather patterns tied to daily clock resets, encounter probabilities woven into step counters, and entire world maps crafted with invisible logic grids that stitch together dozens of gameplay systems without players ever needing to see the machinery, creating a series that feels endlessly simple on the outside while containing layers of complex, interlocking mechanics beneath, a quiet testament to the careful craftsmanship that has shaped the Pokémon world across decades. As we drift into the final stretch of this long journey through the hidden history of Pokémon game development, more quiet stories and subtle mechanics rise to the surface, beginning with the curious fact that in Pokémon Red and Blue, the internal audio engine could only play 4 simultaneous sound channels, and because 2 were reserved for music, battle effects such as growls or slaps often temporarily muted part of the background track, creating the iconic, choppy soundscape older fans remember, not as a stylistic choice, but as a hardware limitation of the Game Boy's limited sound chip. And sliding gently into another quirk from that era, the reason certain moves like Wrap, Bind, and Fire Spin behave so infamously was due to the original partial trapping mechanic, preventing the opponent from acting at all while the trapping move was active, making even weak moves overpowered if used repeatedly. a balance issue that persisted until Generation 2 restructured trapping logic into damage over time rather than turn denial, and drifting into the early Johto games. Gold and Silver's Pokegear radio system wasn't just a novelty. The internal clock tracks every day of the week, and certain radio shows inject unique encounter rate modifiers behind the scenes, such as Buena's password increasing phone call chances or Pokemon music altering wild temperaments, meaning the radio subtly influences gameplay even when the player doesn't notice it. And speaking of time-based mechanics, the day-night cycle in Gen 2 adjusts color palettes, dynamically using the Game Boy Color's master tinting mode, blending daylight, evening, and night hues with surprising smoothness considering the primitive hardware, making Johto the first region where the world visually responded to the passage of time and drifting toward Hoenn next. Ruby and Sapphire's internal berry growth timers operate even while the game is powered off, using a real-time RTC chip that quietly tracks hours just like Gold and Silver's internal clock. Though unlike Johto's clock, Hoenn, its berry timer cannot be reset manually, making Hoenn the only generation where time manipulation glitches were extremely limited and sliding gently across the region. The developers designed the Weather Institute route to showcase moving rain by placing it along a corridor where the engine could safely simulate multiple simultaneous raindrop layers without overwhelming the GBA processor, turning that stretch of Route 119 into a technical demonstration of weather effects long before later games normalized dynamic atmosphere systems and drifting into Emerald's battle frontier. The decision to create 7 distinct facilities came from a desire to present different battle philosophies without changing core mechanics. And each facility includes AI behavior unique to its structure, such as the Battle Dome, focusing on prediction-based movesets, and the Battle Pike embracing probability tables that simulate luck-driven gameplay, making Emerald's Frontier one of the most complex post-game systems ever created. And wandering forward into Fire Red and Leaf Green, the remakes were the first titles to introduce the modern-day breeding IV inheritance formula, allowing babies to inherit 3 IVs from parents instead of 2, a cornerstone for competitive breeding that influenced how all future generations handle stat inheritance. And the remakes also introduced move deleters and move tutors in structured facilities, laying the groundwork for the comprehensive move management systems found in later titles, and drifting into Sinnoh, Diamond and Pearl's internal map scroll speedwa. It's intentionally slowed to create a heavier sense of terrain, which is why snowy routes feel stiff and marshlands feel sticky, as if movement is slightly resisted by the environment. And this approach later influenced the idea of terrain effects in battle, like grassy terrain healing or mud lowering speed, quietly connecting overworld design to battle mechanics and sliding deeper into Sinnoh's mysteries. The Hall of Origin event, originally designed for Arceus, used a unique flute activation flag and sky staircase rendering script. But because the Azure Flute was never officially distributed, the entire event remained unused for over a decade until Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl finally resurrected it, allowing players to experience the fully coded encounter for the first time, making it one of the most significant restored events in Pokemon history.